My mom refused to take my son to the hospital while I was at work. She chose plans with my golden child sister and said his care was my burden. Hi, I'm a 28-year-old woman, and my relationship with my mom has always been strained, to say the least. This time, though, it feels like a line has been crossed, because it's not just about me anymore, it's affecting my son. Let me break it down for you. My mom, Sylvia, she's 56 now, raised me and my younger sister, Adriana, who's 26, on her own after my dad passed away suddenly. From as far back as I can remember, my mom's bitterness has been a constant. People often excused it, pointing to the trauma she endured, losing her husband and raising 2 kids alone. I was always a lively, spirited kid who loved being outdoors and flashing smiles at strangers. But that cheerfulness wasn't something I ever got from my mom. My sister was just 2 years old when Dad died, so I tried to step up in my little ways, keeping Adriana entertained and helping out when Mom seemed overwhelmed. Sure, she'd acknowledge my efforts here and there, but that was the extent of her affection. As time went on, I started to rebel, becoming exactly the kind of ungrateful child she seemed to expect me to be. By the time I hit 13, I had a part-time job, handled chores around the house, and took care of Adriana. But instead of appreciation, all I got were criticisms, tiny things I missed or didn't do right. The constant fault-finding led to arguments nearly every day, so I pulled back emotionally and kept my distance. Adriana, on the other hand, didn't take well to the change. She started trying to get closer to me, but I pushed her away. Over time, it became pretty clear that she'd become Mom's favorite. Mom's favoritism was so blatant that she didn't even show up at my high school graduation because Adriana wasn't feeling well. But that's a story for another time. The moment I graduated, I packed up and left for college in another city. Mom and I didn't keep in touch, neither of us made the effort. Adriana would text me occasionally, and I'd reply when I felt like it. A few years into college, I got married to my now ex-husband and had my son, Jaden. Jaden's got some severe food allergies, 10 specific things that could trigger life-threatening reactions. On our doctor's advice, we switched to a vegan lifestyle, which helped manage his sensitivities. Life wasn't perfect, but we were managing. During this time, I kept in touch with Adriana, but we weren't close. It was mostly casual texts and the occasional call. Mom tried reaching out when she heard about Jaden's birth, but I wasn't interested in reconnecting. Meanwhile, my marriage had turned abusive, so I filed for divorce and moved back to my hometown. Adriana found out and wanted to meet me and Jaden, so I invited her over. When Adriana showed up, she brought Mom with her. Seeing Mom again after all that time was surreal. She acted like nothing had ever gone wrong between us. I wanted to address it, but Jaden seemed thrilled to have company, so I decided to let it slide for the moment. Later that night, after Jaden was asleep, we talked. I confronted Mom about the years of no contact. Adriana stepped in, apologizing on Mom's behalf and calling this visit an olive branch. She said they were all I had left and hoped I'd give them a chance. I wasn't entirely convinced, but seeing how happy Jaden was with them, I decided to try. For a few months, things were okay. I found a hybrid job in marketing that let me work from home, which was ideal since Jaden needed me around. Adriana's college was just an hour away, so she visited sometimes. But with Mom, things were more complicated. She started coming over every weekend to help with Jaden, but it quickly turned into her taking over my house, as if I were a guest in her space. At first, I let it go, thinking it was just her way. But her controlling tendencies only grew, and I knew I had to say something. Instead of confronting her directly, I asked Adriana to mediate, worried a direct argument might get messy in front of Jaden. Adriana agreed to talk to her, which gave me a bit of relief. The next day, Mom called me, furious that I'd gone behind her back by involving Adriana. I tried to explain that it wasn't the right time to talk directly, but she wouldn't stop ranting. Frustrated, I put her on speakerphone and went back to work. Realizing she wasn't getting a response, she eventually hung up. That evening, Adriana called, saying Mom was upset and even cried about how I'd handled things. I told Adriana flat out that I wasn't going to let Mom push me around anymore and that I needed some space from her. Adriana tried to convince me to let Mom stay involved in Jaden's life, but she eventually respected my decision. Mom later texted me an apology, saying she'd back off. A year went by, and things settled. Adriana graduated from college, and Jaden turned 4, making it easier for me to leave him with trusted babysitters when needed. Adriana often helped out, too. One day, I had an urgent work matter and needed a babysitter. Adriana had a job interview and suggested I ask Mom. Reluctantly, I agreed. I gave Mom a rundown of Jaden's allergies and what to do in case of an emergency, even handing her a cheat sheet. She brushed it off, saying, "You can trust me, I raised you, didn't I?" I still made her promise to call me if anything went wrong. She nodded, and I left, thinking it'd only be for a couple of hours. Not even 90 minutes later, I got a call telling me to rush to the hospital. Panicked, I dropped everything and raced over. When I got there, I learned that Jaden had suffered an allergic reaction. Furious, I told my mom to wait outside while I focused on my son and spoke to the doctors. The doctor explained that Marcus had eaten cookies containing gluten, one of the 10 allergens he absolutely couldn't have. Although he was stable now, they warned me that the situation could have turned critical if help hadn't come in time. I promised them it wouldn't happen again and left the hospital, a whirlwind of anger, guilt, and frustration swirling inside me. Back home, Adriana was already waiting. I asked her to take Marcus to his room while I dealt with Mom. Adriana didn't hesitate, quickly leading Marcus away, leaving me alone with the woman I was barely holding back my fury toward. What followed was a heated argument, the kind I tried to avoid for so long. Mom started by blaming Marcus, claiming he ate the cookie when she wasn't looking. But under my glare and relentless questioning, she admitted the truth: she hadn't bothered to check the cheat sheet I'd so carefully prepared. Her carelessness, her arrogance, it was too much. I told her, firmly but without yelling, that she'd lost the privilege of being unsupervised around Marcus. That's when she started crying, accusing me of being overly harsh and unforgiving. But her tears didn't move me. I wasn't going to take risks with my son's life just to spare her feelings. She stormed out shortly after, and Adriana followed, probably hoping to mediate, though I wasn't in the mood for her to try. Later that night, Adriana texted me, suggesting I'd been too hard on Mom. I shot back that if she kept defending Mom, she'd find herself in the same situation on the outside of Marcus's life. Adriana backed down quickly after that. I hired Nancy, a professional babysitter from a reliable agency, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. Nancy was great with Marcus, and I no longer had to rely on Adriana or Mom. Adriana still visited occasionally, but her trips became less frequent as she got busier. We drifted back into our old routine of texting only when necessary, which suited me just fine. Months passed without much drama until one Saturday when I had a work emergency. It was also Marcus's monthly doctor's appointment, and I needed someone to take him since Nancy was unavailable. Her own child was in the hospital. I hesitated but decided to ask Adriana for help. She answered but claimed she had work. Then, without warning, I overheard Mom in the background, saying loud and clear that she wouldn't babysit Marcus, even if she were paid. She called him a burden and complained about my parenting. Adriana tried to hush her, but the damage was done. My hands shook as I hung up, furious and hurt. I immediately called Mom to confront her. She answered with a rushed apology, blaming her words on frustration. She even tried to turn it around, saying I made things difficult by being so strict and weird with Marcus's food. I didn't let her finish. I told her I didn't want her in my life, or Marcus's, and hung up. This time, I meant it. Adriana texted an apology, claiming she hadn't known Mom would say such things, but I didn't reply. I couldn't deal with either of them right then. For the next year, I focused solely on Marcus and work. He'd sometimes ask about his grandma, and while it hurt to see him miss her, I redirected his attention elsewhere. When his 5th birthday came around, I planned a small celebration, inviting only a few close friends and family, Adriana included, but not Mom. Adriana showed up with a large bag of gifts, most of which she admitted were from Mom. I wasn't sure how to react. On one hand, it felt like Mom was trying to reach out, but on the other, I couldn't shake off the anger and mistrust. Adriana urged me to accept the gifts, saying they were a kind gesture, but I didn't feel comfortable. Still, I decided to let it go for the day, not wanting to ruin Marcus's birthday. Later, when the party was over and we were opening gifts, Marcus immediately went for the big bag from his grandma. The first thing he pulled out was a plushie, and I felt a pang of relief. Maybe this wouldn't be a disaster after all. But when I reached into the bag, I found several boxes of cookies from a fancy bakery. I froze. A quick glance at the labels confirmed my fears: gluten, dairy, nuts. All of it was dangerous for Marcus. I hid the boxes, telling Marcus the plushie was the only gift, but he spotted the cookies and threw a tantrum, insisting he wanted one. I didn't know what to do. Finally, I called Mom, hoping she could help defuse the situation. But instead of understanding, she was ready for a fight. She brushed off my concerns, claiming I was being overly cautious and that Marcus wouldn't have these issues if I'd raised him normally. Her words hit me like a slap. I couldn't believe she was blaming me for his allergies, as though I'd chosen this for him. I stayed calm long enough to convince her to tell Marcus the cookies weren't for him. She eventually did, after complaining that I was overreacting. Marcus calmed down, but I was left reeling. That night, her words played on a loop in my head. All the guilt, the anger, the childhood wounds I thought I'd buried, they all came flooding back. I called Adriana, desperate for some support, but she dismissed it, saying, "That's just how Mom is." It was then I realized that nothing would change. Mom wouldn't take responsibility, and Adriana would always make excuses for her. I decided to keep them both at arm's length, focusing instead on the one thing that mattered most: keeping Marcus safe. The following day, Mom showed up at my door with yet another gift for Marcus. I didn't even let her in. I told her, plain and simple, that since she had so much disdain for my choices and lifestyle, enough to endanger her own grandson, she didn't deserve to be in our lives. She immediately got defensive, bringing up how she had raised me through hardships and accusing me of stealing her grandson from her. I didn't waver. I told her that Marcus's safety and well-being came first, and if she couldn't respect that, she had no place in our lives. Sensing her attempts to guilt-trip me weren't working, she shifted to the gifts she'd sent, pointing out how expensive they were. Without missing a beat, I stepped inside, grabbed the bag of presents, and handed it back to her. Then, to make sure there were no loose ends, I wrote her a check for the plushie Marcus had already opened. She told me I was being petty, but I didn't care. I was done with the drama and wanted no strings attached. Disappointed, she finally left. Breaking the news to Marcus wasn't easy. I told him his grandma would be away for a while because she had personal plans. He seemed to accept it, though I knew he didn't fully understand. Later, I got a call from Adriana, who was upset and almost hysterical. Apparently, Mom had thrown a tantrum after leaving my house and worked herself into such a state that she'd gotten sick. Adriana begged me to apologize and patch things up, but I refused. I told her, calmly, that Mom will be fine. That's just how she is. Adriana accused me of being cold and unempathetic before hanging up. I wasn't bothered. If anything, it cemented the distance growing between us. I did feel a pang of regret over my relationship with Adriana, though. I knew we weren't as close anymore, and with Mom out of the picture, I wasn't sure how or if we'd ever get back to where we'd been. As for Marcus, I doubted he'd see his grandma again, and while that weighed on me, I knew it was the right decision. Update 1. Thank you to everyone who shared their support and understanding. It helped me realize I wasn't in the wrong here. I do regret how things turned out with Adriana, but I also recognize that she's partly to blame. Her unwillingness to stand up to Mom and her tendency to justify Mom's actions have made things harder than they needed to be. I decided not to reach out to her until she comes around and apologizes. For those asking how I managed to have an okay relationship with Adriana despite her being the golden child, it's simple: I never blamed her for Mom's favoritism. That was on Mom, not her. Adriana's always been easygoing and tried to stay neutral, balancing her relationship with both of us. But the truth is, her non-confrontational nature has made her a bit of a doormat, and now she's paying the price by dealing with Mom's tantrums. Relationships can't thrive on neutrality alone, and I think Adriana is starting to realize that. Update 2. It's been about a week since I last heard from Adriana or Mom. Knowing how mom operates, I suspected she might try to stir up more trouble, so I decided to take a short vacation with Marcus before school started. Just as we were packing, I got a call from my paternal aunt. She wasted no time laying into me, furious that I hadn't visited mom in the hospital. That was news to me. I hadn't even known mom was admitted. My aunt explained that mom had called her and some other relatives, bad-mouthing me for abandoning her. I tried to stay calm and told my aunt the situation was complicated, but she didn't want to hear it. When she started calling me names, I hung up and blocked her number. I'm expecting more calls from other relatives, but I'm not engaging. Hopefully, blocking my aunt sends a clear message. Marcus and I left for our trip the next day, and I was determined to focus on us and leave the drama behind. Update 3. 2 weeks later, after a wonderful vacation with Marcus and some much-needed distance from technology, I returned home to find more evidence of mom's antics. My mailbox was stuffed with letters from relatives accusing me of being an ungrateful daughter and a bad mother. It was clear that mom was still spreading her version of events, painting herself as the victim. I wasn't surprised, but it solidified my decision to keep my boundaries firm. There was no reasoning with her. At this point, I realized Adriana was my only connection to this mess. I saw that she'd called a few times while I was away, so I decided to reach out. She didn't answer, so I left her a voice note, warning her to keep an eye on mom and the gossip she was spreading. I also told her that if the harassment from our relatives didn't stop, there would be consequences. Adriana called me back that night, acting as if nothing had happened between us. I wasn't in the mood for small talk and asked her to get to the point. She explained that mom was desperate to talk to me and had been begging Adriana to persuade me to give her one more chance. At first, I refused, but Adriana kept pushing, insisting it would at least bring some closure. Reluctantly, I agreed to speak with mom. When I called, mom sounded overjoyed, talking as if everything was fine. But I wasn't here to pretend. I cut her off and asked her why she wanted to talk to me. When I called mom, she started by saying she had been suffering in silence ever since I told her to stay away from Marcus. I almost laughed at the irony, considering how she'd badmouth me to everyone she could. She went on to say she was willing to accept any conditions I set, as long as she could be part of Marcus's life again. For a moment, I felt a twinge of sympathy. I hadn't realized just how attached she had become to Marcus. She even hinted that this was her way of trying to reconnect with me too. But as much as I wanted to empathize, I couldn't ignore the fact that she had endangered my son's life twice and tried to shift the blame onto me. That wasn't something I could forgive or forget. So, I told her no. There wasn't much left to say after that, and I ended the call. The days that followed were quiet. Fewer unwanted calls. Fewer attempts by mom to reach out and apologize. Adriana hadn't reached out either, so I felt like things were finally settling down. Last weekend, I got an invite to the wedding of a childhood friend who used to live next door. Normally, I don't attend events like these because of work and my responsibilities with Marcus. But my friend insisted, so I decided to go. What I didn't anticipate was running into Adriana and mom at the reception. Marcus was thrilled to see his grandma, but I was immediately on high alert. Mom kept her excitement under wraps, at least in my presence, and I stayed close to Marcus the entire time. When mom asked if we could talk, I told her I didn't want to cause a scene and thought it best if we avoided any heavy conversations. But Marcus, in his innocence, started throwing a fit to stay with her. To prevent things from escalating, Adriana suggested we sit together. There weren't any assigned seating charts, so I reluctantly agreed. That way, mom could spend time with Marcus, and I could ensure his safety. Adriana assured me she'd keep an eye on mom, and since I didn't want to ruin the evening for my friend or Marcus, I went along with it. Surprisingly, the night went well. Mom was civil, Marcus had a great time with her, and Adriana and I even managed to clear the air between us. Adriana apologized for putting the blame on me earlier, and it felt like we finally reached some understanding. I didn't talk much with mom since she was occupied with Marcus, but that was fine by me. As the night wound down and we headed to the parking lot, mom stopped me. She asked if the evening had gone poorly, and I told her it was fine. Then she asked, based on how things went, if she could be part of our lives again. I told her no. I reminded her that while tonight had been an exception, I hadn't forgotten how she'd endangered Marcus before and refused to take responsibility. Even if it made me the villain in his eyes, I couldn't take that risk again. Mom began crying on the spot. Adriana tried to calm her down and lead her to the car, but her quiet tears turned into full-blown wailing. Marcus clung to me, scared and upset by the scene. I rushed us to the car, not wanting to draw more attention as people started to gather around her. Once Marcus was asleep that night, I called Adriana. She answered in hushed tones, explaining that Mom had been hysterical after we left. I told her I understood and would call her back later. The next day, after finishing my chores, I sat Marcus down and explained the situation in simple terms. I told him he wouldn't be seeing his grandma anymore and emphasized that he should never interact with anyone outside of school without my permission, especially Grandma or Aunt Adriana. He seemed to understand, especially after the scene from the night before, and he agreed. Later, Adriana called and admitted she was worried about Mom. She said Mom's behavior might point to something deeper, and I agreed. I shared my concerns about Mom potentially continuing to bother us, and Adriana even suggested a restraining order if things escalated further. We also briefly discussed the idea of me moving if Mom didn't back off. Final update. I'm writing this a month later, relieved to say the situation has been resolved. After our conversation, Adriana decided to get Mom checked out by a professional. The diagnosis confirmed what we'd suspected: Mom has severe borderline personality disorder. The psychiatrist recommended admitting her to a private mental health facility for specialized care, especially considering her age. Adriana discussed the recommendation with Mom, and to my surprise, she agreed to it without much resistance. The facility is in another state, so Adriana will be taking her there next week. Adriana mentioned that Mom would be covering the costs herself, which was a relief, as I had offered to help financially if needed. Before they leave, Adriana passed on a message from Mom to Marcus, saying she hoped to get better soon and see him when I allowed it. I decided not to share the message with Marcus. For now, Marcus and I won't be moving since Mom will be out of the picture for a while. Despite everything that's happened, I truly hope she gets the help she needs and can find some peace.